From Fully Batibo, this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, one of the world's biggest exporters of emissions is preparing to mine the seabed for raw materials. Norway may sell the image of green living, but it's got very rich off exploiting the earth. The worst economic slump in 300 years, the biggest budget deficit since World War II, its biggest tax generator diminished by Brexit. How will the UK's finance minister square the books? And Chile's export of cherries to China hit by social media rumors. We talk to the Vice Minister of Trade. Thank you for joining us. Norway became the first country in the world where the sale of electric cars overtook those powered by combustion engines. A remarkable achievement for a country that, in another world first, plans to end the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2025. But like most headlines, there's a huge contradiction in Norway's climate change credentials. Well, the country is Western Europe's biggest exporter of oil and gas and has managed to save $1 trillion in its sovereign wealth fund from exports. Last month, it auctioned off 61 offshore production licenses. Yes, it plans to drill for more oil and gas. That includes some 125 licenses to drill in the Arctic Barents Sea, a relatively unspoiled corner of the planet. While it continues to reduce emissions at home, it's exporting emissions overseas, mostly to China. In fact, Norway is the seventh biggest exporter of emissions after Qatar, the top three being Russia, Saudi Arabia and Australia. Not satisfied with exploiting natural resources of its coast, the demand for green technology could see Norway start seabed mining. It could license companies as early as 2023 to start mining for copper, zinc, cobalt, gold and silver, metals that are needed for wind turbines, solar farms and electric vehicle batteries. Off the coast, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology says there could be up to 21.7 million tons of copper, more than the world's copper output in 2019. Deep-sea mining could generate up to $20 billion in annual revenue for Norway towards 2050, compared to around $61 billion from oil and gas in 2019, and create about 20,000 jobs, Oslo-based consultancy Rystad Energy has estimated. But it's not the only country that plans to mine the seabeds for minerals. China and Japan have similar plans. Joining us now via Skype from Bergen in Norway is Peter Haugan. He's the program director at the Institute of Marine Research and professor at the Geophysical Institute of the University of Bergen. Very good to have you with us, Peter. Thank you for your time. So why is there a rush to mine seabeds?
Well, I think there may be several reasons. It's been coming back the last couple of years, but actually 30, 40 years ago, there was also a rush. People realized that there were minerals on the seabed. I think now there may be several reasons. There is the electrification of the economy, batteries and various supplies, but industrialization in general. And then I would also add that some of the supplies from land-based mineral exploration has some geopolitical aspects. Not all minerals are available on every market, and people then look for other places to find these minerals.
Yeah, and speaking of these other places, many advocates for seabed mining say China has a monopoly on rare earth minerals, so we must all find other reserves. Do you agree with that?
Well, I understand the concern that when resource is located only one place and you need it for a long term, whether it's China or somewhere else, it doesn't really matter. You'd like to have more supplies and more alternatives. So it's an understandable reason, I believe.
There are, of course, a lot of concerns when it comes to seabed mining. TV naturalist David Attenborough warned this year that deep-sea mining risks creating, quote, terrible impacts that cannot be reversed. What are your thoughts on that? How bad could the damage be on the environment?
Yes, it could be bad. And I think the jury is still out. Remember, the deep seabed is the least known environment on Earth, and we don't understand how it works. We don't even know what organisms are there, how the ecosystems are put together. And you can say some of the advocates would say that now we have a scientific study that says that if we do it this way, it will not disturb very big area. On the other hand, I think we know so little about the deep sea environment that we need to know a lot more before you can approve activities on real mining.
And speaking of that, right now off the coast of Namibia, for example, the government of Namibia and De Beers, the diamond company, are scooping up the seabed to find diamonds, which is hardly essential, many people would say. And scientists believe that this could take up to a decade to restore the seabeds there.
Yeah, that's a special case. I know that case, and it's it shows that, I mean, not only the interests that are expressed, and that also applies, I think, to some extent to the green transition and the need for minerals for electric vehicle batteries and so on. There may be other reasons why people mine or want to mine, and I think also in some places the oil and gas industry is looking for other things to do to use their technology and their base, and would like to see new markets like activity for deep sea mining to emerge. Right. So we should always be critical to the rationale for these various actors in this game.
Various actors, including the United Nations, which is quite surprising. The UN issuing licenses for seabed mining in international waters, which a lot of people find surprising, and they're collecting the royalties to pay for UN work. Are we not all compromised by commercialization, you think?
Yeah, I mean, that with the UN has its International Seabed Authority, which was created as a follow-up of the Convention on the Law of the Sea almost 40 years ago. And that came about because of the interest and the awareness that there were minerals on the seabed, and people were putting this mechanism in place, maybe not with the same environmental consciousness that we have today and the awareness of the complexities of the deep sea ecosystem. So that is an issue that we have to deal with.
Peter, I have to ask, from a Norwegian perspective, Norway has done well from oil and gas, but the rhetoric of advocating climate change policy sits uneasy when it's one of the top 10 exporters of emissions.
Yes, this is a complicated issue, and it's a political area which has many aspects to it. And you can also talk about who is to blame for the CO2 emissions. Is it the producer or is it the user of these products? And that's a political question. What is the best way to solve it, by putting the responsibility on the producer or the user? But of course, for Norway, oil and gas has been a very, very important income to the country, and then it's politically difficult to turn down that activity.
Peter Haugan, thank you very much for talking to us about this. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now that Brexit is done, its biggest tax revenue generator, the City of London, has lost its status as Europe's biggest share trading capital to Amsterdam. A shocking transfer of wealth as the finances of the country rapidly deteriorate. On March 3rd, Finance Minister Rishi Sunak, an advocate of Brexit, will need to find money to pay for the pandemic when he delivers his budget. The $2.8 trillion economy slumped to its worst economic performance in 300 years. The country is on course to report a budget deficit of £400 billion. Britons pay $1.1 trillion in tax a year. But the big question is what taxes to increase to pay off the deficit. After a decade of austerity, are the people of UK ready and willing to pay? And according to the Resolution Foundation, 2.6 million people expect to lose their jobs this year. That's about 8% of the working population. So what will the finance minister do? Joining me now from London via Skype is Miatta Fahnbulleh. Miatta is an economist and chief executive at the New Economics Foundation. Very good to have you with us, Miatta, on counting the costs. So, should rising debt be a concern?
In short, no, it shouldn't be a concern. And it shouldn't be a concern for two reasons. The first thing is that the key issue is not really the size of the debt. It's how sustainable that debt is and your ability to pay it down. And we have this strange thing where the debt burden in this country looks big, but actually the cost of financing that debt, because of zero to essentially negative interest rates, is at historical lows. So actually, if ever there was a time to borrow, this is the time to borrow. And the key thing is that 2/3 of the long-term cost of that debt is locked into these really low interest rates. The other reason why we shouldn't worry about it is because we've had a big change in policy from the Bank of England. And what you're seeing is that the Bank of England is essentially underwriting government debt by borrowing bonds. The Bank of England has essentially purchased about half of government bonds. And so those two reasons means that actually the dynamics around debt have completely changed.
Right.
And so this is absolutely the time for policymakers to be investing.
But for a nation that's imposed austerity unnecessarily sometimes, what is the fascination with containing debt?
That is a very good question. I mean, look, it's born out of a long orthodoxy. The rational argument is if our debt becomes too big, if it looks unsustainable, if the money markets think that we're not a safe bet because we can't pay back that debt, and credit agencies decide to downgrade us, that's bad for us economically, that's bad for us financially, and it hampers our capacity to borrow in the long term. But the truth is that I think these arguments have always been overstated, because underlying them is a stronger ideological drive that essentially is trying to constrain public spending because it's trying to constrain the scope, the space, and the size of the state. So I think when people have used debt as an argument for constraining the contraction of the public sector, it's often been driven and underpinned by the political and ideological piece rather than the economic piece.
Yeah, and speaking of the political, you have Joe Biden, the new US president, the IMF, the US Federal Reserve, all saying that now is the time to spend money. Do you think the UK's ruling Conservative Party is listening?
That's a very good question. I mean, they are insofar as they have spent. Our deficit has gone up to in the region of 400 billion. So they have been spending. I think the piece that they may be not listening to is the fact that, what all of those organizations are saying, and indeed organizations here, is don't stop spending. The economy is still really precarious as we come out of the pandemic, as we start easing it. Businesses are on their knees. People are struggling. Do not stop supporting and investing in the economy. And this is where I think the government hasn't quite grasped this, not least because if we look back at the autumn budget statement that the Chancellor gave, what he did was choose to cut day-to-day spending by about 10 to 12 billion every year. Right. So the drive to cut, the drive to go back to consolidation is pretty strong. And it's whether those of us that are arguing that the long-term cost of that are far, far greater than the short-term impact of increasing the deficit win out.
Interesting. You say people are struggling, and that's a reality. We're expecting, 2.6 million people to lose their jobs. How can the Chancellor help?
So for me, there are three things that he's got to do. The first is protect jobs. I think the government did well to introduce the furlough scheme. They would have done better if they'd just introduced it for a 1 or 2 year period rather than this staggered thing that they've done. But the furlough scheme has been a massive lifeline and has saved many jobs that would have been lost. And so as we now look at easing out of lockdown, it's really important that the Chancellor keeps the furlough scheme in place for a period of time. So I would say for a year, but critically, gradually move the scheme into a part work, part subsidized, non-working scheme. And what that would do is allow businesses to keep people on board and the state, the government, to subsidize the time that people aren't working. And in that time that they're not working, offer training so that you can get people out of sectors that might have to reduce the number of people they employ, like hospitality, like the aviation industry. You can train those people up and then try and get them into other jobs. The second is it's got to create jobs. Right. This is the time for fiscal stimulus. We're arguing they need a big green fiscal stimulus. 28.3 billion would unlock 400,000 jobs. If they were to invest another 20 billion in public services and social sector, 700,000 jobs. And then finally, they've got to support people. It's really, really hard for so many people out there. Right. And our social security system is completely inadequate. They need to be thinking about how they bolster that up.
You talked about, of course, the UK slowly easing out of coronavirus restrictions, of the lockdown. What do you think is going to have the biggest impact on the economy? Will it be the pandemic or Brexit?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think in the end, in the short term, it is without a doubt the pandemic. I mean, the economy shrank by 11% because the government essentially had to freeze the economy. That is unprecedented. The scale of the impact, the worst annual contraction for 300 years. So in the near term, the pandemic is all consuming and is definitely the big driver of any economic woes that we have. I think as we move into the medium term, where, if you like, the sort of short-term shock of the pandemic is eased, there will be a Brexit impact. And we know there's going to be a Brexit impact. All the projections suggest for long, 20, 25, 30 years onwards. And I think that's where it begins to play. So it's definitely, if you look at the numbers, the UK has done worse than other countries. And in part, that's to do with the sort of Brexit dynamic, but that's been kind of masked by the bigger COVID shock. But as we sort of move out and the economy regains itself and rebounds, the impacts of Brexit will be long felt.
Yeah, so a long road to recovery. Thank you very much, Miatta, for speaking to us. Miatta Fahnbulleh from the New Economics Foundation on Counting the Cost. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Now, exports of cherries from Chile to China have taken a hit, and it appears to be all because of a rumor. Unsubstantiated reports began circulating on Chinese social media that traces of COVID-19 were found in some boxes. Our Latin America editor Lucia Newman has the story from Santiago.
All year long, producers wait for this moment, when their cherries go through the final stage of selection, sanitation, and packing before being shipped off to China. For the Chinese, this color, red, brings good fortune. So they import cherries, mainly from Chile, to celebrate the Chinese New Year. But when an unsubstantiated story went viral on Chinese social networks, it brought misfortune to Chile's multi-billion-dollar cherry industry.
¿Esto es una información no oficial?
This was the result of non-official information in China, a rumor that's provoked a steep drop in demand, that our government is working round the clock with the private sector to see what we can do.
When claims began circulating that some imported cherries had been found to be tainted with COVID-19, overnight exports plummeted from 500 to 0 containers a day. Australian cherry producers have also been impacted, but not nearly as much as in Chile, which exports much larger quantities.
We have never been formally accused of anything by Chinese sanitary or customs authorities. It's just a story in the media that was never retracted. The ones who suffer most are the small and medium-sized producers who've invested everything they have and went into debt betting on a good year.
The president of the Exporters Association says exports are picking up, but that the cherries are being sold at a loss. And time is running out. It's summertime in the southern hemisphere, which makes these cherries particularly valuable because they are picked, packed, and shipped at a strategic time for the Chinese market. But unlike these grapes, these cherries will spoil in just a matter of weeks. Chile has launched an intense counteroffensive in China, using influencers and scientists on social networks to try to convince consumers that their cherries are safe to eat. All this is more than just bad luck. It underscores just how vulnerable fruit exporters are to a negative tweet or story, substantiated or not.
Lucia Newman, our Latin America editor in Santiago there. Let's get more now on those cherry exports with Rodrigo Yañez, who's Chile's Vice Minister of Trade, and he joins us via Zoom here in Doha. Thank you very much, Mr. Yañez, for being with us. So cherries, a $1.6 billion export industry for Chile. Let me ask you first if you were surprised that the Chinese government did very little to face down these rumors. Why do you think that is?
Well, actually, the governments at the local level made statements to clarify this situation. And public officials from the health sector in China gave interviews explaining to the people there that the consumption of cherries and fruit more generally and food was safe. So we have been in contact permanently with the Chinese authorities. We got their support in terms of disseminating the proper information, the proper news. The issue is that this is a huge market, and this year we were expecting to sell over $2 billion in cherries. So, like the report well said, we were working round the clock to change the tide wave against this, the fake news around consumption. And I think we had an impact in price, that it's absolutely correct. But we were able, at the end of the day, to recover this season.
All right, let's talk about the relationship with China a bit more. Chile is a very open economy, of course, and there are concerns across political parties there that Beijing is slowly taking huge stakes in the power grid and their efforts to legislate against this right now. Why?
Well, this is something that is, I would say, a hot topic, not just in Chile, but elsewhere too. And when a country like China is, which is our top trading partner, it's natural that they also start becoming more important in its investment influence. And we do not have an institutionality in terms of investment that distinguishes or discriminates origin or discriminates any country. And that will remain as such. But there is a discussion which, for us, it's something that should be considering, for instance, OECD standards when thinking on doing some sort of pre-screening, which all countries, including China, do. So that's an ongoing discussion. We're not close to it. But regardless of the mechanism, what we want to convey to all foreign investors is that Chile is and will remain an open country which will not discriminate any origin or any country.
As you say, China is a big trading partner. They invest $1 billion in the food sector alone. Again, politicians in your country fear that China is taking advantage of the pandemic right now. Do you share those concerns?
Well, not really, because the operations, it's not that we have seen a jump or booming of Chinese investments given the pandemic. This was started to happen before. And what we see is that there are lots of opportunities to be grasped by different countries in China. And some legislators certainly have more concerns about it. But we have faced it at the Congress, also trying to display the tools that there are, the tools that also recognize better practices. And that's the road that we want to keep and maintain.
All right, let's move on and talk about the pandemic and the effect it's had on your economy. Vaccines, of course, are now being rolled out around the world, and Chile has the most advanced rollout of vaccines anywhere in Latin America. Tell us how much damage the pandemic has caused on the Chilean economy.
Well, a big impact. We will perhaps, and we finished last year with a 6% decrease in our economy. Nevertheless, we're among the least affected countries, along with Brazil, given the pandemic. We expect a bounce back this year, and our economy should expand by 5.5 to 6%. You know that there is a big commodity prices boom right now, and half of our exports relate to mining. So we expect to recover, and also one of the pillars of that recovery is our vaccination campaign, which is extremely ambitious. We hope to get 80% of our population inoculated by June, and we're doing well so far. More than 3 million people in Chile today are vaccinated, and we expect to close March with 5. So the government, in that sense, has made it a top priority, betting, on different platforms, vaccines. And again, like I said in the beginning, our principle is not discriminating any potential solution. So we got Pfizer, we got AstraZeneca, we got Sinovac from China. We are talking with Sputnik 5 as well. And I think that pragmatic approach, has let us have the position that we have now in terms of the rollout of the vaccination campaign.
So, Mr. Yañez, you're here in the Middle East talking sovereign wealth funds, looking into investing in infrastructure and green hydrogen, which is produced from renewables. What progress have you made, and what do you hope to get out of this visit?
Well, we talked about trade and how China, for instance, is our top trading partner. But we, as an open, small, distant country, need to, again, look for new frontiers for our trade. And that's what we're doing here at the GCC countries also, given the momentum that the region is going through, in particular, the GCC after the blockade of Qatar ended. And what we did in Riyadh was to sign a historical first agreement with the GCC, which we hope will lead to start an FTA negotiation with the GCC countries in the future. And what we look also is not just more trade, but also more investment. So that's why I'm meeting with all sovereign funds of GCC countries in this visit, because the visions that we have seen in these countries align very well with the opportunities that we can offer. You mentioned green hydrogen. According to McKinsey, Chile is very well positioned for that race in the future. But we also talked about infrastructure. We also talked about digital economy. We have invited these countries to join the DEPA agreement, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that we have with Singapore and New Zealand, and food security, which is very important for these countries and where Chile has a lot to offer as a very strong food exporter country.
Thank you for your time. Rodrigo Yañez is the Vice Minister for Trade for Chile.
Thank you. Have a good day.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at FullyBatAJE or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Fullybat Thibault from the whole team here in Doha. Thank you for watching. The news on Al Jazeera is next.